you didn't hear any of that. Anyway, welcome everyone. I'm delighted to see that the number is fast approaching 40, and every one of the 40 is welcome to this, the first of these initial North-South public theology meetings. We're breaking new ground because until now we haven't gone outside our own Methodist circuit. But we were delighted that our Methodist counterparts in Laoghaire proved to be so enthusiastic about joining us in this present venture. However, let me emphasize that this is not a meeting only for Methodists, but for those of all faiths and none. Nor is it purely for any one political group. It is for all of us who share this common space called Ireland. Our history shows that we have not been too good at doing this peacefully, and it is our hope that these conversations will help to make each of us better informed and more accommodating. And I'll say no more except by repeating my welcome to you all, with the hope that you have a pleasant and informative evening. And now I hand over to Johnston McMaster.
Alan, thank you very much. I think I've unmuted and hopefully I'm being heard.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Welcome to all of us, and thank you for the introduction to the series. We decided that the first conversation would be around the theme of a Christian vision of reconciliation for Ireland. And I'll give a little input of about 12 minutes or thereabout, and then Ian will allocate us rooms for the conversations together. And a couple of questions will be suggested at the end. They will be in chat box. You may stick to those questions or you may not. There may be other questions that are raised, and hopefully there are. But we will try to explore this evening a Christian vision of reconciliation for Ireland. Now, any expression of a vision of reconciliation needs a context. And the context of reconciliation for Ireland is global as well as local. And the global context can be described in this way. Quote, "We are living at a critical juncture in the history of human life on Earth. Our lives are more interconnected than at any other point in history, and we face a diverse array of truly troubling global crises. As well as interconnected, I think we can say that we are also more interdependent than at any other point in history. And the troubling crises we face are climate change and environmental degradation, poverty and inequality, misogyny and sexism, and global migration and refugees. And all of these are also interconnected. We do reconciliation in Ireland in this global context. We have a local context as well. Since 1981, the phrase "the totality of relationships" has been part of our public discourse, and it became the spine of our internationally and legally recognized Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. The totality of relationships was expressed as three strands of relationships, without which there would be no peace and reconciliation. I suppose, given a level of forgetfulness after 23 years, and that 1.8 million children have been born in Ireland since the agreement of 1998, we may need reminded that the three strands of relationships are those within Northern Ireland, those between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and the East-West relations between the islands of Ireland and Great Britain. That is a local context, and there is no vision or practice of reconciliation without these three interconnected strands. Now, 23 years on, in a world which has changed, and indeed Northern Ireland and Ireland which have changed, we need a fourth strand of relationships, our relationships to and with the earth. So we have a global and local context for visioning and doing reconciliation in Ireland. Let's look then at a Christian vision of reconciliation. To speak of a Christian vision of reconciliation for Ireland is not to suggest that it is the only vision. There are other religions in Ireland and on the planet with their theologies, visions, and practices of reconciliation. We need conversations with those religious traditions. And there are also secular, humanist, and philosophical visions of reconciliation, and again, we need conversations. And there is a Christian vision and practice of reconciliation with its place in the public square with all the others. Any Christian vision and practice of reconciliation will draw from its primary sources, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Testament. For those who claim to be Christian, Jesus and Paul, both Jewish and steeped in their Hebrew Jewish writings, are key practitioners of reconciliation. They modeled it in what they lived and taught. In the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Jesus never acknowledged the binaries that made separation between lepers and well persons, law keepers and sinners, the good people and the others. He refused to see the world and people through binary lens. He lived and acted as though there were one world for all, and he created that reality. The world is built on binary existence, the West versus the rest, the new Cold War binary of the US and China. And Irish life and history are framed by binaries and binary thinking: Protestant, Catholic, nationalist, unionist, Republican, loyalist, and a host of others. And even the Belfast Agreement couldn't get away from binary identities. The Christian vision of reconciliation following Jesus refuses binaries, doesn't acknowledge them, and lives and acts as though there were one world for all, and reconciliation in practice creates that reality. Each of the Gospels was written for a faith community struggling to live authentically and faithfully in particular socio-political contexts, primarily in the context of life dominated by Roman imperialism. Matthew's faith community was presented with a vision of reconciliation, at the heart of which was the Sermon on the Mount, the essence of which was the Beatitudes. Here was the blessedness or well-being of life in God's kingdom as distinct from Caesar's kingdom. They were challenged by the most radical of what Jesus taught: love of enemies. Love seeks the highest good of the other. And it was challenging to love those hated Romans, or whoever is thought or believed to be the enemy. But how else? And this was Jesus' point. How else can the cycle of violence be broken, the spiral of hate be interrupted, the destructive and deathly power of the past be broken, vengeance deconstructed, and swords turned into plowshares, weapons of death into implements of life and well-being? At the heart of the vision and practice for the Matthean community was also active nonviolence. They had a memory of Jesus, who practiced active nonviolence in a world of Roman imperial militarism, and also refused to be part of the violent paramilitary liberation movements within his own community. It was the way of the cross for him, and the practice of reconciliation for the Matthean faith community. How in Ireland do we deconstruct our mythologies of violence and our obsession with militarism and the myth of redemptive violence? The commitment to and practice of reconciliation for the Matthean community was not just radical love of enemies and radical active non-violence, but radical community inclusivity. English Bible translations give us Matthew as, "Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." Being perfect terrifies us with its moralism. The Aramaic behind Matthew's Greek is, "Be all-inclusive, as your Father in heaven is all-inclusive." God doesn't leave out, exclude, or discriminate against. All are in, included, all matter. Luke translates the same verse, "Be compassionate, as your Father in heaven is compassionate." And the biblical word compassion means solidarity, especially with the nobodies, poor, suffering, vulnerable, and left behind. The Matthean community had a Jesus-shaped vision and practice of reconciliation. Paul was the other great practitioner of reconciliation. To the Corinthians, he complained that they were not a faith community fit for purpose. And his litmus test for that was reconciliation. Paul's great reconciliation text is not just 2 Corinthians 5, but 2 Corinthians 5, 6, 7, and 8. 4 chapters, no less, littered with first-century Greco-Roman economic vocabulary. Paul's Greek for reconciliation was indeed a key economic word. And when Paul's reconciliation text is read in literary context and the socio-political context of Corinth, the reconciliation praxis he's calling for is socioeconomic and environmental reconciliation. Reconciliation is dealing with poverty and working for a society of greater equality and sharing in solidarity. Reconciliation is also the shaping of a new creation, the mending of a broken environment, instead of being at war with nature, being in solidarity and friendship with nature. For Paul, in other words, there is no reconciliation without social justice, social and eco-justice, he would say today. This is the heart of the letter he wrote to the Jesus people at the very heart of the empire in Rome itself. It's the very Jewish heart of Romans 5, God's way, and the way of the faith community in putting relationships right is through social justice. Reconciliation is when relationships are rooted in social justice, when the arrangements of power that shape a society are just, inclusive, and fair, when all have equal access to political, economic, educational, and environmental resources. So a Christian vision and practice of reconciliation for Ireland, the world, and the earth draws on Jesus and Paul. At a critical juncture in the history of human life on earth, and for the earth itself, and a critical juncture for Ireland and the United Kingdom, we need a new vision, commitment, and practice of reconciliation for the 2020s. We live in a crucial decade for the world, for the earth, and for these two islands. And we do have a vision, a commitment, and a praxis of reconciliation for the 2020s. There are two questions at least which you may want to discuss. What does it mean for us to refuse to see the world and Ireland through binary lens? How can we practice reconciliation in a global and local interdependent context in the 2020s?